Now we're going to have a traditional software guy talking to us, Dan Reed from Microsoft. And he's going to talk to us how a traditional software vendor is going to move into the cloud, I think. Dan.
Thanks, Ludwig. I got one. So we're right at early afternoon, so I will talk about a few things that I think, as we think about the continuum from what Mark talked about with infrastructure to what was just talked about the enabling technologies of networks. I want to say a few words about where I think that the vision of next generation devices is going, because one of the things that's important to remember about technologies in general is that all successful technologies are invisible. In fact, the only technologies that have had transformative effect are the ones where people don't realize anymore that they're using the technology. The other thing, and I was a professor for most of my life, and so one of the things I learned over the years is that the questions rarely change, but the answers do. And the answers change in the technology business because the ratios of capacity and performance, of computing, of storage, of networking, and the price of those components shift. And the innovation really rests in the ability to understand those shifting ratios and take advantage of those transitions. And so if you think about what that really means, I think our fundamental challenge is this. In almost all of human life, we rely on linear change. Tomorrow mostly looks like today. Now, there are exceptions of that, and when they occur, they're usually catastrophic events. But in general, tomorrow looks like today. With exponential change, of course, tomorrow looks like today, and the day after tomorrow looks nothing like today. And that transformation is our challenge and our opportunity. And I think the fundamental issue that we face in the intersection of clients and clouds is a version of what ALVIN TOFFLER talked about years ago about future shock. Some of it is related to the huge volume of data and how we extract insights from data, because we've fundamentally gone from a world where computing was rare and precious to a world where computing is so inexpensive that we can afford to think about it, using it in profoundly different ways. And despite the revolution of the web, despite all the things that we've talked about here, I fundamentally believe that we haven't deeply grasped that transition. That when computing becomes essentially free, you psychologically change the way you think about using it. You use it to empower people. You worry less about optimizing the infrastructure. You worry about how you empower people to do new and interesting things. And so think about what's happened over the last 60 years. This is a version of the slide that Padmarie used as well. If you think back over the last 60 years, at the end of the Second World War, fundamentally, we had one computing device per planet. We long ago passed the ratio of 1 to 1. Now, to be sure, it's woefully and inequitably distributed, but we long ago passed that ratio of 1 to 1. What are the implications of computing becoming, for practical purposes, in many cases almost free? And what I'm going to argue is this notion of invisibility, that the combination of many clients plus cloud gives us the option of empowering individuals to do some new things and some new ways. And fundamentally, one aspect of those is how do we escape a 40-year-old model of computing? Because despite everything that we've seen over the last 40 years, the model of computing, regardless of what mobile device you use, hasn't really changed. It's still a passive model that relies on windows and menus and pointing. It's an explicit notion of computing rather than an explicit notion of computing. And there are huge opportunities to think about how we leverage natural interfaces, the world of interconnected devices at widely varying bandwidth, and more importantly, this notion of ubiquitous access to information. So what are the enabling technologies for these kinds of things? It's certainly the rise of inexpensive devices. It's the notion of embedded technology in everyday devices. I mean, Mark talked about how many computers we own, but in point of fact, if you stop to think about how many devices you actually own today, unless you've been living in a cave, you probably own 1,000 or so computing devices. Right? Unless you're driving a World War II vintage car, it's got hundreds of computing devices in it. your entertainment system, your communication system, your microwave oven, they're all computing devices. And we can take advantage of that capability because computing has become so inexpensive. And as we think about weaving that web together with the huge volumes of data that come from those sensors, we have some opportunities to do some new things. We also have some deep social challenges. And so let's talk fundamentally about the biggest one. And that's the rapidly evolving notion of privacy and security. Because we don't own up to this future shock about the rise of data and sensors and have an informed debate about its implications, some interesting things are going to happen. And that's where that notion of exponential change and our linear adaptation of social notions are pretty profoundly in conflict. And we have to think globally about what it means to deal with privacy and security for sensors and data at scale. And so the clients really do enable the experiences, but they are the ones that become invisible. And these are our pictures of our traditional client devices, but as I was saying, most of the devices that we care about in the future will become implicit and invisible. And so the specialty devices will rise in diversity, will rise in number, and the real question will be what kinds of things do they enable us to do? There were lots of estimates of the volume of data that has been produced. This is one. I won't stand here and talk to you about the information theoretic content of that number of bytes that have been produced. It's arguably much smaller. But how we extract insights from that data, everything from the world of smart sensors and what it means for smart grids, intelligent transportation, adaptive energy management, intelligent communication, brings opportunities and it brings challenges. And this is a place where the notions of privacy and security really come into play. So think fundamentally about our social notions of those two things. They're deeply rooted in physical notions. Person home is their castle. My individual person is private. And yet in a world of international data flows, what we're really talking about are logical personas. And in point of fact, each of us has many, many logical personas. They partially overlap across our diverse social networks. And we have shifting notions of what information we're prepared to share. So the notion of binary access is fundamentally flawed. We need to think about what's a claims-based notion of access. Ludwig gains access to data for this purpose, and only for this purpose. He gains access for a bounded amount of time, and there were limits on his ability to share that data with someone else. So the notion of transitivity, of bounded lifetime, and claims-based access are important and fundamental. And we need to think about the technical mechanisms to enable those, and about the diversity of cultural perspectives we have around the world about what's acceptable use and sharing. To go back to where I started, the opportunity really, as we think about the rise of inexpensive computing, think fundamentally about the mobile device you have. It's more powerful than the fastest supercomputers were in the world 25 years ago. It's true. That's a profoundly interesting statement. And when you couple that with the rise of data, we have an opportunity to shift the dialogue about the notion of what computing really is. Because all of computing to date, by and large, has fundamentally been passive. And so think about the following concept. Your laptop, your mobile device, your web browser, unless you literally poke it, it sits there. It does nothing for you. We've optimized the infrastructure largely around the performance of the devices rather than around the individuals. And so as we think about shifting from a passive notion of computing, let me go back here, to a notion of computing that works on our behalf. I mean, what does a good human assistant do? It makes you look better than you really are. It anticipates the things that you want to do. It does them before you think about them. It understands emotional context. It understands the broader set of issues that are conflicting objectives, and it makes dynamic optimizations about those things to help you be productive. That's what any good human assistant does. We have an opportunity to build that kind of world with computing, to shift from a passive world to an active world where we really talk about what, as I said, a good human assistant does. They deal with conflicting objectives, they anticipate, they provide input, they understand context, and they adapt. And they do so without being instructed. And so if you think about what that means, a good assistant understands your emotional context, whether you're tired, whether you're busy, whether you're frustrated, whether you've been interrupted. And they help you complete tasks. And so we have a chance to do a bunch of those things. And it will rely on this huge web of hundreds or thousands of devices that interact at varying bandwidths with diverse computational models to provide that notion of implicit and active computing. And so when we think about these future shock notions, there are opportunities to think culturally and deeply about some of the possibilities, about the issues, about transition, about some of the dynamics associated with that. And let me, at this point, see if we can run the video, and I'll come back and talk about these social issues. This is a little visionary video about the notion of intelligent computing to respond in a diverse set of ways about how people might interact. So as I said, many of the notions are about how we use implicit computing to enable creativity. So imagine a simple example of what a good intelligent assistant does in a meeting like this. I dare say everyone in this room has had the same experience that I have had at conferences over the years, which is someone walks up to you, begins to talk with great animation. It's clear they know who you are. You desperately hope they will give you a social clue about their identity before you're embarrassed to admit that you don't remember who they are, where you met them, or what context was associated with that. So imagine a mobile device that can take, it's a buttonhole camera that can take a picture of you, extract some features, upload that to the cloud, query that, whisper in your ear, just like any good assistant in the receiving line does, that says, this is X, you met them at this place, ask them how their daughter's doing in college, and break the conversation. Now, of course, hope that the other person is not doing exactly the same thing to you, which could happen. So these issues, though, about access to data and what are culturally accepted norms are deep and profound. And the challenge about how we create a dialogue around those issues to deal with exponential change, the rise of huge volumes of data in the cloud, and the opportunities to think about a new model of implicit computing are going to require us to bring together the creative skills that this audience represents, the technical skills in networking, in clouds, in mobile devices, in form factors, and understanding of social dynamics to support that kind of model. And so there's a huge opportunity here, I believe, to rethink fundamentally what's a 40-year-old model of computing. The cloud provides access to the data and the context to make those things happen, and the mobile devices create the experiences that relate to that data and enable the things that we really want for the future. And so with that, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll turn the floor back over to Ludwig, so perhaps we have a few minutes for some discussion.
Thanks, Dan. So, thanks to all three of you. Yes, we have some time for questions, and since we only have like 5 minutes for questions, we want to have this kind of more collaborative. I'm going to open this up to questions from the audience, so if there's a mic. So who wants to ask the first question? Over there.
Yes, I guess my question was, it seems to me that one analogy that wasn't made yet, but maybe Werner will make it when he speaks, is cloud computing.
Could you speak up?
Sure. Cloud computing as a utility, this transition from compute power as a utility like gas or electricity. And the question is, if it's a utility, should we be concerned about regulation as some companies essentially become the dominant providers of this new emerging utility?
You want to take that, Padma?
I think one of the things that I was trying to address in the point I was trying to make about the shift in the economy and the business models, I think business models will fundamentally change. What gets regulated is, I think, up to be debated. I think in the technology space, the more you regulate, the more you stifle innovation. I think pricing models and how pricing gets tiered will probably be something that will change, and the value will shift to more rich applications and rich services as opposed to how they get consumed, right? How they get consumed, possibly our view will be in a hybrid model always for a long time, because there'll be some sets of applications and sets of data that will require very high levels of control and security that will be premise-based. But possibly that will shift in terms of how much of it is premise-based and how much of it is cloud-based.
Werner Vogels is shaking his head. Do you want to reply to that? You're not here. OK. I have one question for Mark. I mean, in your... And he doesn't have a mic, so in Salesforce, the service salesforce.com, in your cloud and in Shatter, you amass a lot of data, which you could mine. I mean, you probably know better than the Fed what's going on in the American economy, or the global economy for that matter. Shatter allows you kind of to probably mine or find out about the secret structure or groups in your company. I mean, are you actually doing this, or are you planning to do this, perhaps?
Well, I get that question a lot, actually. And a lot of people say, well, you have all this, you have 100,000 organizations, business information, millions of users, very valuable information. But the thing that you need to understand is that, number one, it's not our information. It's our company, it's our customers' information. So number two is we don't access that information. In fact, that information is totally black. That is, we can't even see it. It's encrypted. It's to us, it's just the same as anything else on the disk. So we don't mine the information. We don't aggregate. We don't try to make broad generalizations about what's happening in the economy. I don't think that that's an appropriate use of our apps. And I'll tell you why. Because people will then ask, yes, but can't you get customers just to opt into that, and then wouldn't that be fine? But the reality is, the single most important thing we do every day is trust. Nothing is more important than the trusted success of our customers. And that secure trust that we have with our customers, that's the key to our brand and really what we do, more than the technology. And I think that if we all of a sudden offer that type of a service or that opt-in, I think customers would get confused, and I think it would start to impact that trust. Because without trust, you don't have cloud computing.
There's another question over there.
A question just related to your answer. I can imagine that you say that and that your company believes that, but I assume the data, my company would store your data with you, are based in the US. And I think the WikiLeaks story has shown that the US government may force US companies to do things what they never would like to do, but at the end they are forced. How can you give comfort that your promise will be delivered when the US government has other views on that?
Well, I think, a couple of things, and Werner wants to speak to that also, but, I think the really interesting thing about cloud computing and WikiLeaks and security and trust, number one, WikiLeaks was an on-premise database from a database provider. We don't have to go into the details of which one it was. And the most important thing in regards to the security and trust of your data is how it's managed. And if you want to use a US data center from us, you could do that. If you want to use one of our international data centers, like Singapore or Japan or the EU, you can do that as well.
So actually, I don't want to spend too many words on the WikiLeaks issue. There was no, as we said at that time, they violated our terms of service. There was no government intervention at all. So that whole story where you say that US government will force particular customers off the cloud is nonsense. Yeah, it's never been the case, and I think we made a very clear statement about that. But actually I want to address the security issue much more. What? Oh, sorry, I'm Werner Focus, I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Amazon.com. One of the pioneers in the whole cloud world, let's put it like that. I want to come back to the notion that the cloud in some way would be less secure than actually hosting your own data on-premise. Yeah? If you talk to many of our customers, the moment that you go sit down with them and actually drill deep into what are their current security practices, and if you compare that to the security practices that they can deploy in the cloud, never, ever has there been a moment where one of our customers has said, we will not move to the cloud because of security concerns. Yeah, there's a myth out there that this cloud is less secure. Actually, the cloud gives you opportunities. Given the amount of resources and the amount of effort that companies like Amazon and Salesforce and Microsoft are actually putting into their security of the cloud to actually build better security than what you would ever be able to do on your own premise. Yeah, if you look at if you have a business on the net, on the internet, and security is not your number one priority, you should not be on the net. Not now, not in the past, and not in the future. You are putting your customers at risk. And I think at Amazon, we clearly know how to do customer security and how to protect our customers' trust. So as a business, moving on to the cloud, your security is our number one concern. And will always be our number one investment area for any company that works in the cloud is security. Yeah? And actually, we are doing so much innovation that you will get security tools that are not available in the enterprise. They're actually of higher quality than you would ever get. Want to comment on that, Dan?
Yes, I would. And I would echo everything that Werner just said and what Mark said as well. I mean, fundamentally, the issues that apply here are technical, they're cultural, they're management. There are always risks. There are risks managing your data yourself. And in fact, most of those stories about the breach of individual data sets in small and medium-sized businesses are never talked about. And to Werner's point, one of the things that comes with aggregation and experience and expertise is focus on enabling technologies to maximize security. That means, as Mark said, deep issues such as the hosters of the data themselves cannot decrypt and access the data. It truly is black. And there are attestation and certification mechanisms for customers to verify that fact. There are hardware issues and management practices about supporting the data. Those are technical issues. Let me talk about the legal issue, which is the one that reared its head here, and the fear that many people have about the US Patriot Act, which is fundamentally where parts of these issues apply. Microsoft operates a worldwide suite of data centers for precisely those purposes, across the EU, across Asia, across the US. There are fundamental issues that we will have to come to grips with socially and legally, which is the fact that all of us are international people. And that means that even if your data resides in a site, in a location that you believe is protected technically and legally, the people who access it do not stay within the borders of an individual country. And so how we think about that transnational flow and access is a deep and fundamental issue. And it's one where we need to come to grips with the dialogue about those social and legal issues. But I absolutely agree with everything that Werner and Mark said about the technical aspects of security. It is something that Microsoft takes incredibly seriously, and an enormous amount of effort invested in cryptography, hardware support, management, and physical security to support its cloud data centers.
And I guess we need a panel next year about kind of the social and the legal implications of this first global utility we're building. Thanks a lot, and I hope you're going to stick around for the next discussion or panel. I'm going to interview Guy Roseri, the manager of Madonna. Thank you.